The majority of Republicans, I think, save for about 10 or 11, voted against it. What if you vote against this legislation, this bipartisan legislation? What are you for?
Well, it's interesting. Rodney Davis, who's the ranking member of House Administration Committee, basically said something. I think this is an exact quote, something close to it. The system worked, right? So I guess the riot was okay. I mean, I know that Davis was not in favor of the riot, but to say that the system worked without change when we had that kind of riot and an ex-president who whipped people into a frenzy by lying to them, that's just dumb. And, you know, the Republican leadership whipped against the bill. I think it's very unfortunate, but it is a bipartisan bill. And of course, there's bipartisan work in the Senate to also do a bill. There's a lot of overlap. There's a few dissimilarities, but I'm confident that we can bridge what few gaps there are and come up with a good, strong, bicameral, bipartisan law that will make our country safer. And I hope we can do that in the very near future.
The Republican leadership whipped against the existence of the Select Committee. The Republican leadership wanted people who are under scrutiny for their roles in trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And I wonder if the Republican members will be a focus of your next public hearing.
Well, I'm not going to get into what the hearing will be about. I leave those announcements to the chair and vice chair. We do think it'll be worth watching. There is new information. As you know, we've worked throughout the summer. We've interviewed quite a number of people and received quite a lot of documents. But I will say I'm disappointed, although unfortunately not completely surprised, that the Republican leadership has been so unwilling to take steps to make our country safer from insurrection. But, you know, in a way, maybe given that a majority of the Republicans voted to overturn the election, maybe it's not a surprise.
I want to show you something your colleague in Congress and on the committee, Liz Cheney, said about Donald Trump's criminal exposure and culpability.
As we detailed in our January 6th hearings, a federal judge has reviewed evidence submitted by the January 6th committee and concluded that former President Trump likely violated 2 criminal statutes when he pressured Vice President Pence to reject legitimate state electoral votes in our joint session. That's what Vice President Pence called, quote, un-American. In our hearings, we have demonstrated that President Trump knew specifically that what he was doing was illegal, but he did it anyway. President Trump's conduct was illegal under the existing Electoral Count Act, and it would be illegal under this new bill as well.
Now, Congresswoman, we don't know what we don't know about what has gone on at DOJ before. Congresswoman Liz Cheney and other committee members started citing the criminal statutes that they felt they had you have all mustered the evidence to prove had been violated. But we do know that since your dramatic public testimony and since the evidence was marshaled in public, that the DOJ investigations are further along. I wonder if you can talk about whether additional crimes will be introduced into public evidence and additional evidence will be presented to prove that those crimes should also be under investigation.
As you know, Nicole, we have laid out facts and for the most part not attempted to make a criminal law case because that's not the role of a legislative committee. Congresswoman Cheney was appropriately, in that clip you just played, quoting a federal district court judge who reached a conclusion based on the evidence he'd reviewed that ex-President Trump had and Dr. Eastman had violated the law. We've laid out evidence that shows that that is the case, as Liz Cheney just pointed out. But there are 2 things that the Department of Justice has to do. They need to identify evidence that a crime has committed, and then they need to make assessments of whether the evidence is sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that's the case. So that is a job that they have to do. The legislative committee can't do it for them, but we will be laying out some additional information. And as I say, some of this has to do with the culpability, whether it's moral or criminal on the part of the ex-president, but some of it is outlining ways that we can make our country safer, as we did with the reform of the Electoral Count Act. And there are some other things that we're looking at that would make us less vulnerable to misconduct that we saw, such as the ex-president engaged in.
Congresswoman, can you legislate yourself to safety when the ex-president is participating in vigils for the insurrectionists and describing the Capitol police officers who protected Democratic and Republican members of Congress a disgrace? Can you protect against the leader of one of the two parties who's aligned himself with the QAnon conspiracies?
Well, those are very alarming, and I think un-American things to do, honestly. You can't legislate somebody having some shame. You can't legislate having somebody make somebody honorable in their conduct. But you can make it more difficult to distort. For example, as Mr. Ayers said at our hearing, the ex-president told people, an armed mob, that Vice President Pence had the ability to throw the votes out. Well, that was not the case. But there was enough ambiguity in the statute that he could get away with that lie. If we change the statute, it's going to be very clear that that lie is false. So that helps.
Congresswoman, news has broken since we last had a chance to talk to you that the committee has successfully negotiated an interview with Ginny Thomas. And what has been put into the public arena through investigative journalism, especially at the Washington Post, they've reported on the emails she sent to actual legislators, urging them to overturn the results of free and fair elections in their states and deny the will of the voters in those states. That is also part of the insurrection that is under criminal scrutiny by the Department of Justice. But I wonder what the committee's interest is in Ginny Thomas.
Well, as we've indicated publicly, we have an interest in discussing with her the various activities that she knew about relative to the fake electors and efforts to overthrow the election. Now, she said publicly that she can clarify everything and that she is willing to come in, and I'm glad that she's following through on that. I don't want to jump ahead and say what this interview will yield because we haven't had it yet. But I'm looking forward to all the information that she can provide us. And once again, this is a legislative committee, not a criminal investigation. We do, however, have a strong interest in what Dr. Eastman did. As you know, he took the Fifth Amendment before the committee all day. And, I think he took the Fifth Amendment because he must believe he has criminal culpability. And she, of course, had extensive communication with Dr. Eastman.
I wonder if you want to know about conversations between Ginny Thomas and her husband, who is the lone United States Supreme Court justice to dissent from the decision that freed up many of Donald Trump's records to be used and consumed as part of your investigation.
That would not be a focus, I don't think, of our investigation. Our investigation is to find all the facts that led up to the January 6th riot, an effort to overturn the election. And I wouldn't say that any conversations between husband and wife would ordinarily be within the scope of that investigation.
What do you make of the public distrust of the United States Supreme Court dropping to historic lows? I think since 2001 to 2021, Gallup, who records whether the public approves of and trusts the Supreme Court, tracked a 20-point drop. And at the same time, you have the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice who is the lone dissent in a decision to turn Donald Trump's records over to the committee investigating a deadly insurrection. You have her at the center of what we know is under criminal investigation, the fake electors plot. What do you make, just as a member of a co-equal branch of government, about the public sentiment about the United States Supreme Court?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the court's actions on a number of cases have made the court seem like just another partisan institution. And the justices should take care that their actions don't feed that perception. The fact that new justices voted to throw out a 50-year precedent after telling the U.S. Senate that they had no intention of doing so helps also undercut confidence in their nonpartisan activities. So, it's not for me to tell justices when they should recuse, but ordinarily the recusal is when there is a conflict or whenever there's an appearance of a conflict. And I think many feel that Justice Thomas would have been well advised to consider that standard when hearing that case. But it's a broader concern than just that case. We've got now a court where the decision is predicted based on the partisan appointment of the judges. That didn't used to be true. And it's really a very serious matter for our country when that institution, which is supposed to be above politics, is rightly perceived, unfortunately, as being much of politics. So we've got a lot of repair to do.